There we
All
go.
right. We are recording now. Fantastic. So I'm Amalia von Hohensee. I'm in the Barony of Stonemarch, which mundanely is the state of New Hampshire in the East Kingdom. So we are going to be talking for the next hour and a half about Opus Anglicanum. And I do have a handout for any of you just joining. I'm going to post it one more time myself. Oh, thank you, Elena. So you can go ahead and take a look at that. I also have a slideshow that I'm going to be going in and out of, just so that you guys can get clearer pictures, because I know holding stuff up to the computer is not quite as effective as showing the actual digital image. So if you all just take a sec to pull up the handout, it should say Opus Anglicanum, Materials, Techniques, and History at the top. And so we are going to start out with a brief history of Opus Anglicanum. So Opus Anglicanum, the term, is just the Latin word for English work. That's all it means, as in the work made by people in England. And this generally refers to the ecclesiastical embroideries, so the embroideries made for the church, that were made between around 1250 and 1350. So these works were lavish pieces of embroidery. We're going to take a look at some specific examples in just a minute. So these were not the pieces that were being made by, the common people to decorate their clothing or anything like that. These were large, lavish works of embroidery, generally made by professional embroiderers. These were worn by popes and cardinals and the very important members of the clergy throughout both England and continental Europe. We have written records of popes wanting their own pieces, and we have records of kind of diplomacy happening, that kings would have these commissioned for the high up clergymen in the church. So these were big pieces of embroidery. These were not what was being done by the common folk. These were also proof of international trade and negotiations that were going on. Silk is not something that can be made in England, or at least could not in period. The cold damp of the English climate was not conducive to the growth of silkworms. And so all the silk that was used was imported from the Far East. And what they would have done was, the actual cocoons themselves were too fragile to import, so they would reel them and then take that raw silk, and that is what would come to England, and would be processed there by the silk women. Later on, closer to, I think, 15th and 16th century, we do start to see silk being produced in Spain and Italy, because those climates were more conducive to that than England. But for the beginning of this embroidery period, all that silk was coming all the way from the Far East, which is pretty incredible if you think about it. So a little bit more on who made these. We do have records, especially earlier in this period, that end of the 13th century, we have record of women making these pieces, as well as men. By the Tudor era, we tend to think of the embroidery guilds as being men, but we definitely have records of women making these as well, which is a really interesting detail. One of the kind of funny things about this period of embroidery, so we have the embroideries that were made for the church, but then we also have the embroideries that were made for kings and queens and royal courts. And these were two very different types of embroidery, at least in terms of the processes used. And they were also widely varying in what we have left of them. So for the royal embroideries, the embroideries made for kings and queens, we have lots of written accounts of what these embroideries were like. We have receipts that talk about the materials that they use, that they actually enumerate the price and the labor, and all the different aspects of those embroideries. We also see them enumerated in wills and other documents. So we have a lot of written record about royal embroideries. ecclesiastical embroideries, which is what Opus Anglicanum is, we have the physical remnants. We have the actual copes and chasubles and the robes. But ironically, we have very little written information. So, and I forgot to mention, for the royal embroideries, we have almost no extant examples. There are maybe 2 or 3 that come to mind of English royal embroideries. Things made on the continent, that's a different story. But talking specifically about England, we have very little of that royal embroidery left in extant examples, but we have a lot of written record. Whereas for the church, we have a fair number of beautiful extant examples that are available in museums that you can see pictures of, but we have very little in terms of written documentation of the process or the materials or who made them. So it's a very interesting dichotomy to think about. So we know that there were royal workshops for the making of the royal embroideries. The church embroideries could have been made there, but they might not have. We just don't know. So there's a lot of interesting questions, even though we have so many extant pieces. So moving on to talking a little bit about these church vestments. So these were meant to display, lavish, complex scenes. They were meant to show the power of the church. There are a couple different types of vestments that were used. There's a vestment called a cope, which is that big semicircular piece that you often see. And those were worn during processions. They were meant to really show off opulence in a very obvious way. So the copes are the biggest vestment that you would see, and those were meant to be seen kind of from far away by lots of people. They had lots of narrative scenes on them. Then the chasuble is a different robe that would have been worn in the same church service, but that was put on for the Eucharist. And the chasuble is a very interesting garment in terms of the iconography or the images that were shown on it, because it was worn during communion, during the Eucharist. Usually there was a scene of the crucifixion on the back. But additionally, there was often a bunch of other stuff too. There could be an Old Testament story or a New Testament story. And often on the copes, those processional garments, we see lots and lots of saints scattered all over the garment. So there are different iconographies that you'll see based on the church season. So obviously, these were such expensive and complex garments that you didn't have a different one for each week of the year. It's not like every Sunday was a different garment, but they did change the iconography based on church seasons. So you would have a couple. For example, you have chasubles that have the crucifixion, but then also images of the lineage of Christ. The tree of Jesse is one that you often see. And so that would be worn during Advent when we read the, X begat, X begat, X begat, X sections in the lectionary. So the iconography would change based on the church season. But they also designed them to be fairly flexible, even in terms of church season, so that you didn't have to have, 20 different robes for a single congregation. Again, because these were so expensive and labor intensive and opulent. So do we have any questions about the history before I get into, and I can take a look here, questions about the history before I get into looking at actual pieces? And I'll give you guys just a sec.
And you want us to type questions into the chat window, and we can do that as we go, right?
Yes. So you guys, yeah, if anyone has a question, you can unmute yourself and just throw it out there now. But as I'm talking, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat. So if you have questions about the history, go ahead and put that out there now. Okay, so what are the dates? We're looking specifically at 1250 through 1350 in England. Were these more big churches, or would all have some form? That's a great question. These tend to be associated with more major churches. However, even I think smaller parishes might have had some form, probably not the more opulent kind. But for example, I'm thinking of the Bacton altar cloth, which is much, much, much later. This is Tudor embroidery, but it was a gift possibly from Queen Elizabeth that was passed on to become an altar cloth for a smaller church. We know that popes would gift their robes to the churches that they originally came from. So that's sometimes how these got into smaller parishes. But definitely, the Pope, the Vatican definitely had robes. The bigger churches would definitely have had these robes. Let's see. Would these belong to the church or the priest? They would have belonged to the church. These garments were not. So unlike royal embroidery, which was made for a specific person, a specific king or queen, these were made for churches and church seasons. So you don't see, for example, medieval, what would have been then modern saints on there, because they were intended to be more flexible and to last for a longer amount of time. If you think about it, styles were changing a lot in terms of what royal tastes might want. One king might like a certain kind of garment, and another king might like a completely different kind of garment. And so the types of embroidery used there would reflect that ability to change quickly, which is why there are so few things left, because things would get recycled, or they would take all the jewels and pearls off to make stuff for the next king instead of having to remake everything from scratch every time. Whereas the church embroideries, those could get passed down from generation to generation, from priest to priest, and they still applied because they were not made for such a specific use. Were there precursors that trace the journey to this style? So yes, we do see, all right, let me get in my book here. There is one example that we have from pretty early. I think it's like 1170. That is one of our earliest examples of the gold embroidery. Where is, yes, here it is. Okay, yeah, the Saint Cuthbert stole. So this is back, oh wow, circa 916, actually. That's even earlier than I was thinking. So this is a good 300 years prior, and you can definitely see, I mean, the gold background, that's clearly leading up to the Opus Anglicanum style, which we'll talk a lot more about in just a second, what specifically makes that. Are there many secular embroideries? I seem to remember one in the V&A. So there are not very many that exist today. Let me see if I can find in here. This, by the way, this is a fantastic book. I have this listed at the end, and I think it's backwards for you guys. It says English Medieval Embroidery. This is the catalog of the Victoria and Albert exhibit that happened several years ago. That was a real big deal because you don't get to see these very often. They when you display embroidery, it actively is damaging the fibers to be under the light, which is why so many of these aren't on active display. Yeah, it's a good book. All right, let me see, because there are a few examples of the royal embroideries, but there are really not very many. There is a horse trapping in here, and then there is I think it's the jupon of one of the kings. Let me see. Yes. Okay. So this cute little thing is a horse trapping. So this is a very early embroidery. I think this is more towards, yes, this is right around 1200 is where that's coming from. And then let me see real quick if I can find that jupon. If I can't find it now, I'll look for it again when we're done. Because it's very interesting. There are little fragments of applique that you can see on it. And applique, yes, here it is. Applique is not a technique you see on Opus Anglicanum, but it was one of those faster embroidery techniques that would absolutely have been used for these royal embroideries. So you can see these little outlines of the fleur-de-lis. That was most likely an applique piece that has decayed, and you can kind of see the lions down here. So this is one of the few that survive. There is not very much that survives in terms of secular embroidery in England from this period. And I specify in England because we do have surviving European, continental European pieces. Was ornament used with Opus? I'm going to talk about that in a second, but that's a great question. Okay, so now let's move on to some specific embroideries, because I want to talk about the stitches that are used. So let me share my screen here. Da-da-da. Okay. We are going to share that screen. Okay. So this is a great example of a chasuble from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Can you guys see my cursor here on the screen? Yes. Awesome. Okay.
Yes.
So I just want to point out, so chasubles are one of the few examples of where church robes did change style, because you can kind of see here at the edge. I'll make that, whoops, that doesn't work. Chasubles used to extend farther out in this kind of wider triangular shape, and you can actually see it's been cut down. There's a little bit of a figure that clearly used to extend farther, and also on the other side here. So they did actually edit some of these pieces, which is horrifying to think about, but that's what they did, so that they could continue to be of use even after styles had changed. So this is, again, the chasuble, which is the vestment that was worn during the Eucharist. This is, and I'm mostly using images, actually, I think I'm exclusively using images from the Met Museum, because these are open access images, and they're also really nice high-res images. The V&A, they don't let you look as close, but you can zoom in real close on these. So it's a fantastic resource. This is a cope. So again, this is that processional garment. So you can see it's real big. And the design for copes was very interesting. So you can see that the design radiates out from the side, or rather going from the center out. So you can imagine that the priest's head is here, and this is hanging down the front, and this is going down his back. So you see different scenes depending on what angle of the priest you can see. And you can kind of see up here, this is a little nod to most likely whoever commissioned the piece or helped pay for it, probably, these little heraldic devices. While these pieces were not made for specific people, they were often commissioned by specific people who wanted to, in their little bit of vanity, wanted to be remembered for all time. And so you do occasionally have little bits of heraldry creeping in, even to these ecclesiastical pieces, which is... Yep.
Quick question. Someone else clicked on to presenting. So please don't, just be careful, because if someone else clicks present now, it jumps to their screen.
Gotcha.
But if you go back to Amalia to present, also if you switch to presentation mode in Google Docs, it'll make it should make it appear full screen.
Oh, it makes it bigger. That's nice. Okay. So I'm going to go back to resuming my presentation. Resume presenting. And here we go. Present. That's lovely. All right, can you guys see that bigger now? Okay. Great. All right, so moving on. So there's a little note in the handout that says that Opus Anglicanum pieces made during what I'm calling the golden age of 1250 to 1350 pretty much just use two stitches, which is really fascinating. Split stitch, which you can see here in the robes, and the underside couching for the gold. So this is a lovely detail from an orphrey fragment from the Met. This is on the earlier end of Opus Anglicanum. I think it was 1290 or something like that. So you can see it's just the 2 stitches here. And notice how directional the split stitch is, that we're going horizontally for folds that go horizontally, and then vertically for folds that go vertically. And then notice the face detailing. This is really interesting, I think. So the way that faces are, quote, shaded, because they're not actually using different colors, but you'll notice that the direction of the stitching is creating a 3-dimensional effect, even within just one color. So this is the skill that the Opus Anglicanum embroiderers were showing. And you notice the hair is also very directional. And this creates that 3-dimensional effect. So something that historians often discuss when talking about Opus Anglicanum is the, quote, degradation of the style, which is a very dramatic way of saying it, that supposedly occurs after 1350 or so. So what starts happening around 1350 is that people start to take shortcuts in the production of Opus Anglicanum, because these pieces took years and years to complete. We have a record of, I think it was 4 women taking 3 3/4 years to make one altar frontal. So that's how time and labor intensive this style was. So for as we get later into the period, into the 14th century, people start taking shortcuts. And so historians like to, and art historians talk about this as the degradation of the style. It's really the changing of the style, so that more things could be produced faster. So here's a great example of what happens after 1350. And first of all, I want to note, this is not an English embroidery. This is from the South Netherlands. So we start to see this style popping up in more countries. The English embroidery starts to wane in its supremacy, and embroideries on the continent becoming more sought after. So you'll notice here, we're not actually using split stitch anymore. This is long and short stitch, which is much faster. Well, not much, but it is faster than split stitch. There are not many things that are as slow as split stitch, as I discovered. And notice the biggest change is the gold. Notice that this is surface couching. This is not underside couching. And we'll talk about the difference in techniques in just a second. But you notice you can see the couching thread on the top. Whereas if we go back just a sec, we go back here. Whoops, that's not what I meant. No, go away. Done. If you take a look at this piece, you can't see the couching threads. This is underside couching, as opposed to this is surface couching. So that's one of the big differences in ecclesiastical embroideries that start appearing later. You'll also notice right in this halo that's in the sort of center left of the image, there's the beginning of ornoué. And ornoué starts to pop up around 1390, 1400. We think it started developing in either France or the Netherlands, or maybe both. So that's not an English embroidery technique. That's not an Opus Anglicanum technique in the sort of traditional sense of that term. It's sometimes maybe called Opus Anglicanum because it's often seen in medieval ecclesiastical embroideries. But if you're going to get really technical about definitions, it's not technically Opus Anglicanum. So yeah, we start to see ornoué. And in fact, we start to see pieces that are appliqued on. Figures would be embroidered on linen and then appliqued onto a piece of velvet. So instead of having to cover the entire background with stitching, you let the velvet, you let the opulent fabric do the work for you. of looking rich and opulent and lavish, and then you applique the embroidery on. So that's another faster technique. Okay, so any questions about that? I will stop sharing for just a sec. Do you have any questions about the specific stitches used before we go into materials? All right, we have a bunch of stuff here. Let's see.
Yeah, no questions have been dropped into the chat room.
Okay.
So it's
Okay, so that I will move on to materials. And if you have any questions, again, just stick them in the chat and I will take a look. So, but my whole research into, yep.
One question did just come in before we switch topics. Was only underside couching used in early pieces?
Yes. Well, I won't say that categorically. Most or all of what I have personally observed in pictures has been underside couching. For the most part, there might occasionally be details in a piece. Nothing specifically comes to mind, but occasionally you'll see a technique that's not split stitch or underside couching. For example, when they embroidered seat cushions, there were specific little depending on what you were stitching, there might have been a convention for how it was stitched. For the vast majority, I would say, were underside couching. I hate to make always and never statements, but a lot of the time, underside couching, until we come to that degradation of the style that I was just talking about. Okay, so let's get... Actually, before we go back to the screen sharing, I just want to show you guys. So this little book, and I think it's backwards for you guys. It's the Craftsman's Handbook, Il Libro dell'Arte. This is the Cennini book that I'm going to be talking about. This is like $7 on Amazon, and it has some amazing information in it regarding how to mark your embroidery. This is a handbook that was written for artists. Oh, it's the right side. Fantastic. Good. Yes, it's backwards to me. So this handbook was written, Cennini is a painter, an artist, and he wrote this handbook for other painters. But he talks in here about how painters would do work for embroiderers. So that it's very interesting. He talks about painting on velvet and all kinds of, it's, you know, the sections are short, but they're absolutely worth the book to have, in my opinion. So he has a whole section on designing for embroiderers. So now we'll go back to my little slideshow. Oh, whoop, wrong one. Okay, so let's resume. So, so the reason I got into this whole research was because I wanted to create my own piece of embroidery. And so I wanted to start this process as historically as I could, just to see what it would be like. So I want to note, first of all, that embroiderers would not have done this step. Artists, visual artists, painters, maybe illuminators were the people who would have been transferring the design in period. However, I didn't have one of those on hand, so I did this myself. So Cennini talks about how to mark for embroidery. And he talks about how you want to stretch your linen first before you're marking on there. And this actually matters a lot because linen is a pain to draw on if it's not stretched taut, especially if you're trying to use a quill like I did. I do not recommend trying to use a quill on unstretched linen. So what I did was I did lightly go over the design first. This design is from the Luttrell Psalter. I did not create this image myself. The Luttrell Psalter is an English Psalter dating from around the 1325-ish. that I used as the inspiration for my piece. This is from the first psalm, the first initial of the first psalm in the Psalter. So I first just lightly traced it in pencil. So I did cheat a little bit. But then after I had traced it, I put it onto my slate frame back here. So you can see it's laced in nice and taut as I started marking it on. So Cennini talks about making black ink. I originally was going to use oak gall ink, but then I remembered that we see in later embroideries that's a fairly corrosive material, and you'll get there are holes in the fabric. Mistress Amy last week did a fantastic Tudor embroidery, Elizabethan embroidery presentation, and you could see where black things had decayed and degraded, perhaps because of this acidic ink. So I didn't want to use oak gall. I wanted to use a charcoal-based ink, and I couldn't find one easily, so I just decided to make it. Cennini describes that vine charcoal was used, so I just got little sticks of vine charcoal and crushed it up, mixed it with a little bit of water and gum arabic, and it seemed to work fine in terms of the marking. Nothing rubbed off. It was pretty permanent. So it did actually functionally help. It was better than just marking with pencil, which was fantastic. For your own embroidery endeavors, you don't need to make a quill pen or ink unless you really are feeling extra about it. I was feeling very extra that day, so I did it. You could totally just use a pencil or a marker. You don't need to worry about washing lines off. We absolutely still see markings from period embroideries. So these days I just use a pencil or a black ink pen if I'm not, going the whole 9 yards. So that is absolutely fine to use more permanent marking. You don't need to use invisible ink or anything like that. So in terms of the backing material, basically what was available to them was linen, silk, or wool. Wool is very rare in terms of extant examples. That doesn't necessarily mean they didn't use it, but we have maybe one or two with wool as a backing fabric. Much more common is silk, twill, and linen. And then later on, towards that end of that sort of golden era, around 1320 or so, we start to see velvet coming in, silk velvet. When you're stitching on linen, often there was a layer of fine linen on the top where the embroidery was done, and then on the back there was a coarser layer of linen. So often you were working through 2 layers. So getting into silk, do we have any questions before I get into silk? Because silk and gold, we're going to get into some nitty-gritties.
Yes, there were a couple.
Okay.
And then there's also, we started with a comment.
Okay.
For those of you who are curious, yes, she is that amazing, and she became our Kingdom A&S champion. So for those of you who don't know Amalia here, this was she is our current East Kingdom Crowns Champion of Arts and Sciences, which she won for that project.
Yeah.
Another comment. We have a question. We typically use white linen as the ground fabric. Was this the case in period, or would they use a more neutral color?
That's a good question. I don't know if they specifically whitened the linen. The linens that I have seen, they're, slightly yellowed. I'm assuming that's from age and that they would have been whiter. But we do have some examples. Let me see if I can pull up. Yes, this little I'm going to screen share here. There's a great little fragment that I did a lot of study from the Met that I will show you. And we'll study a close-up of this later. But you can see off to the left-hand corner, that's the bare linen. So I'm assuming that was whiter in period, but maybe not. But that is the raw linen. You can see that, and you can see that little black line along the left-hand side as well. Were there any other questions?
Yes, the question was, I lost my chat screen. Oh, the wool that you mentioned, was that in white or in other colors?
What was the wool example? I think it was blue that was used as a backing, but I'm blanking on what that piece looked like. I know it exists. I'm pretty sure it was not white. I'm pretty sure it was either blue or red.
And then last question was the design traced directly or was it prick and pounce?
Okay, so that is a really good question. So what Cennini talks about is he tells the artist, stretch your linen and then go to town on it. Draw directly on it with your ink and your pen. He does not mention anything about pricking or pouncing. We start to see pricking and pouncing later. There's a woodcut from 1527 that clearly shows someone using the prick and pounce method. I have a little theory that they didn't start using this until later, until the end of the 14th century, when they started mass producing these embroideries. We do start to see these really fascinating pieces where on the right side, there'll be an image, and then on the left side, there will be a suspiciously exactly mirrored version of that. And what we think happened was that they did use pricking and pouncing. They used it for one side, and they flipped it over. Because if you think about it, once you have a stencil that's already pricked, you can use that to create a whole bunch of other images. Whereas the method that Cennini describes of just drawing straight on the linen, that's a one-off thing. You do it once and that's it. You don't have a quick method. And in fact, one of the authors that I read was saying that prick and pounce kind of eliminated the need for that artist intermediary. The embroiderer could just start out by themselves with that template. So I have a feeling that that started to be used later as these pieces were trying to be produced more quickly. Okay. Moving on, let's get into the nitty-gritties of silk and gold. Okay, we're going to share a window. Okay. So for the silk that was used, so there's an important differentiation that I want to get across, first of all. So there's spun silk and there's filament silk, and these are two fundamentally different substances to work with. So if you look at the top here, this is spun silk. Spun silk is essentially made like cotton or wool a thread would be, which is that you spin fluff. Basically, that's what spun silk is. It is spun fluff. The fluff comes from other manufacturing that's been done with silk. But if you think about it, silk in its raw form isn't fluff. Silk in its raw form is a cocoon. It's like a spider web, essentially, which is these long, very tiny, very strong filaments. So on the bottom of the screen here, I have filament silk. And the very bottom image there, you see that one little tiny line, that is one single filament. A filament is called a sugah, S-U-G-H. It's like sugar without the R. And so when you group the sugah together, you get filament silk. Filament silk is also reeled silk. Both of those terms are, I believe, synonymous. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that they are synonymous. Whereas spun silk, you can see here, this is plied. You have to ply it because you have to spin it to begin with. Filament silk, it can be either spun or what we call flat. So in this period of 1250 to 1350, we are seeing flat filament silk. As we get later into Elizabethan era, then we start to have this question of, was it still flat or did it become twisted? And we're not going to talk about that today, but that is an option for later period embroideries. But for this period, we are dealing with flat filament silk. And you can it's very clear looking at the embroideries. You can see how incredibly shiny the silk is. That very lustrous sheen comes from the fact that the light is not being interrupted at all by any spinning. So it almost glows. One of the really cool things in creating this piece, because you don't get a chance to see a lot of these embroideries in person, because A, they're in Europe, and B, they're not displayed very often in order to protect them. And so seeing this embroidery in person, it is impossible to capture in a photograph all of the nuances that you get with filament silk. It's really quite incredible. So the shading of the draperies in these pieces was something that the English embroiderers were really famous for. This is something that made these pieces really special and required a great degree of artistic skill. So for the silk shading of draperies, generally we see 4 colors being used. So I did use 4 colors here. So you can see there's this lightest shade, a sort of medium light, and then we have a medium dark and a dark. And different embroideries, you'll see different shading, different ratios of light and dark thread. On some of the embroideries, you see a little bit of dark and it's mostly light. On some of them, you see more of a balance of light and dark. And of course, some of that, we're not sure if the threads have faded over time. That's a very strong possibility. Obviously, they were more vibrant in period, and we just don't know how much they have faded. But you can see that direction of stitching is also very important. So where the cloth over his knee, for example, is draped vertically, we have vertical stitching, whereas we have draped across his shoulders, we have some horizontal stitching. And you can kind of see a mistake. This is from the piece that I created. So the shading of his body was one of the first things that I did. And you can see how off to that upper left-hand corner of the torso, it kind of looks bacony because I was not following the line of where the cloth would have fallen on the body. I was trying to be very literal about following the shading in the original illumination from the literal Psalter. And I realized that, no, that doesn't work. What the embroiderers did was they were very careful about, when stitching cloth, following the line of the cloth. So for example, where this is going off to the side, I should have had that going up and down. So following the line of the cloth is very important for shading. And I had talked already briefly about the face, the direction of stitching. So again, if we go back to this face here, you can see that the little apple in the cheek and the direction of the stitching from the forehead down into the nose, that's very characteristic. And so that's what I tried to recreate here. There's a little circle here, and then the stitching going down from the forehead into the nose, as well as the way the hair is outlined in that kind of swirly effect. So that is the silk portion. Does anyone have questions about the silk before we get to gold?
Yes, we have a couple of questions.
Awesome.
Actually, before we get to the technical one, we had a request. Would you be up for sharing the presentation in addition to the handout?
Oh, yes. I'm going to give you my documentation. I have that on my Google Drive. I will, in fact, I'll just give that to you now that we're thinking about it. Let's see. Just give me 1 second. Nope, that's the wrong document. Let's see. Here we go. Sorry, Google Drive rearranged my documents for me without telling me. Okay. Here we go. So I'm pasting in the chat right now a copy of my documentation, which has a lot of the pictures that I use in the documentation are what I'm using in the slideshow. Let's see.
And I will answer the other question because it's an MOS one. The video will be shared afterwards. It takes us a few days to get it formatted, uploaded, and all of that. But the East Kingdom MOAS office, we have several of these, and we hope to have a whole batch that we can release by this weekend. Hopefully all the tech stuff goes out. And then scaling back, we had a question, do you have to use a laying tool to keep everything flat? How do you keep it untwisted?
Okay, so this is a great question. Let me see if I can find an example. So a laying tool would be nice. I should just first state that when I was doing these embroideries, I was not able to use all the period tools because I have a baby, and I did this while she was nursing, and so I had a baby on my lap, and then embroidery kind of stuck on my chest, balancing precariously. What they would have done in period was they would have had their nice slate frame laid out horizontally along like little trestle tables, so it would have been nice and flat. And yes, using a laying tool, let me see if I can find mine, is helpful, but you can see in the extant embroideries where the thread has twisted, because it looks a little, the thread lays, the light reflects off it a little bit differently. So this is a malor, this is a laying tool. This is used in modern gold work, but it was also used in period. So these you can still get at embroidery shops. This is from Berlin Embroidery, and I have that resource on your handout. But yeah, let me just real quick see if I can find an example of where the silk got twisted. Let's see. All right, it's not coming to me right away. If I find one as we're going, I will point it out to you. But you can definitely see areas where the silk has gotten a little bit twisted and the light just reflects off it a little bit differently. And I did discover that happened in my own piece. All right, let me see if I can find some of it on here. Okay. And I know it's hard to see on the computer screen here. Let me see. If you look at, I'll use this to point. Right above the dark line, the light bit there, you notice how it looks a little bit different. That's both the direction of the shading, but also it got a little bit twisted as I was going. So you do notice the occasional twist. If you had to stop and lay each stitch flat, you would never finish. It would just take too long. But yeah, that's an excellent question. Let's see, any other questions?
Yes. There was, oh, and another one just came in too. So we had a question from Sarah Lynch. Is outlining done first or is color design done with outlining afterwards?
Okay, so that's a really good question. And I tried looking at the backs of pieces to figure this out, to see what threads are going over what other threads, because the threads that went over a thread would theoretically have gone in second. I believe that the darker threads were done first with the lighter shades coming in later. And I did start with a black outline. So what I did the first step was I started with a black outline, then I did the dark shades and graded to the lighter shades. And let's see, when shading, did you bring in a new line of color, then go back? Yeah, so I would do all of one color in a section, for example. And I don't know if this is how they did it. This is how I did it. There isn't really a way to know. But for example, I didn't do all of the blue at once because I was trying to teach myself how to do this as I was going. I did, for example, this bit of blue. I did all the dark, then all the medium dark, all the medium light, and then all the light. And then I moved on to another section and went through that same process. In terms of the black outline, I started with the black outline. But the more that I've thought about it and the more that I've looked at the backs of works, I'm wondering if the black outline might have actually been done last. When you look at the backs, it looks like the black thread is actually running sometimes over other threads. And the black is often so badly decayed, I believe because they must have used an acidic black dye, that it's hard to tell even what stitch is being used. I use split stitch, but I think they might have used back stitch in some of the pieces. So anyhow, that's a whole barrel of cats there. But yeah, that's a really good question of what order you do it in. Okay. So moving on to the gold, which is the real kicker for this piece. So underside couching in and of itself isn't necessarily super hard in terms of technique. The difficult thing for me was finding the right material. So we have, so I tried pretty much every different kind of gold thread that I could find. I tried. So I was trying to find a balance of a thread that was both period materials and the right size. I originally was thinking that period materials were more important than the size, but you'll see where I got to in my experimenting. So I started with this top piece. I have my little gold sampler here. These are all the different threads that I tried. So this is gilt number 4 passing on silk. So the core of this thread is silk, and the outside is gold metal. And it's kind of hard to tell because it's small in this picture, but you can see how the gold is kinked kind of strangely and the pattern isn't laying very nicely. If you look at the gilt number 3, I have a single line and it's a little clearer there. Let me see. And so then as we move down, I'll just briefly describe each thread. So gilt number 4 on silk, this is a passing thread. Gilt number 3, this is also a passing thread with a cotton core. B&J, that stands for Benton and Johnson. They're a manufacturer of gold threads. They make a synthetic thread that's called 341. This is a very thin thread. So number 4, the threads are numbered by size. So number 4 is slightly bigger than number 3. Number 4, I think, was 0.35 millimeters. Number 3 is 0.25 millimeters. And I should note, as I'm getting into this, that the threads that have been measured on extant pieces are between 0.25 and 0.3 millimeters. That's on your handout. You don't need to try to remember those numbers. So the period threads were between 0.25 and 0.3 millimeters. So I was trying to approximate that. So the gilt number 4 at 0.35 was a little too big. And you can see that 0.05 seems like a negligible, tiny amount. And yet it really adds up when you're adding layer after layer after layer next to each other. The gilt number 3 was 0.25, but that was still kinking up because, as I discovered later, passing thread is designed to have a less flexible core. It's a little bit stiff on purpose so that when you're laying it on top of a design, it lays nicely and it's easy to do surface couching on top of it. So it doesn't pass through the fabric as nicely, or rather, it doesn't pass through it still maintains some of its own shape when it passes through fabric, which was why it's creating all these funny little kinks, was because the interior fiber is a little stiffer than you want for this technique. So the Benton & Johnson is a very tiny thread. This is probably 0.1 millimeters. I didn't find an actual measurement, but it's very, very small. And so you can see the pattern is turning out nicely, but it was synthetic and very small. And so that was my sort of last resort option. So then we get into Japan gold. And I want to talk about Japan gold for a minute because we hear this term when you're first getting into metal thread embroidery, you hear the term Japan gold thrown around a lot. And that's kind of become synonymous with synthetic threads, or at least it had to me until I started this project. And so it turns out that Japan thread is just a completely different type of thread than the passing thread, number 3 and number 4 that we were just looking at. Japan gold, so if you look at this photo, you can see these kind of little segments. These are the wraps of gold. And this thread is actually silk with real gold. So this is really nice thread. But if we go back, if we go back here, this was my sample of underside couching with real Japan gold, and it looks like a hot mess. That is because the wraps are so long. So each of these is probably a millimeter or so much bigger than the wraps on passing thread. So if you look at these little tiny wraps here, so that's the difference between Japan gold and passing thread is, well, there are a couple differences, but that's the big difference in terms of the underside couching. So Japan gold, just to give you a little bit of background, this is a descendant of a thread type called a membrane thread. And those threads were made by literally putting gold leaf over a membrane, either parchment paper or hide or something like that. So, some very thin material that was gilded and then cut into strips and wound. And so as you can imagine doing that, you can only cut a strip of material so thin. Whereas when you're making passing thread, this requires wire drawing technology. And that was a technology that was just, I believe, coming into existence at this time. Wire drawing allows you to make very, very fine wires that could then be flattened out and wrapped around the thread. So you get much more wraps per inch. And that is really important for getting a good, clean look for the underside couching. That's what allows you to pass through the fabric and not have it kind of shred up or bunch up on you. Not quite. So if you look back at the sampler, just to go through the rest of the threads, I next tried zari thread. It's a gold thread that's used in Indian sari making. And that was quite good. But the wraps were just a little bit uneven and they were just a little on the big side. I finally found gilt tambour thread. Tambour embroidery, it's that funky embroidery that uses a needle that looks like an embroidery hook. So the thread is meant to pass through the fabric and to pass through easily without any kinks. So if you think about it, it really makes sense that tambour thread would work well for underside couching. So at the end of your handout, I talk about, I got my gilt tambour thread from Berlin Embroidery. It was not that expensive. It cost me about $15 for all of the gold on that piece. So it's not as unapproachable as you might think. So gilt tambour was the winner of the big gold thread issue. The next sort of thing to think about with the gold is how are you going to get your pattern? So I'm going to stop sharing at this point and talk about, did the gilt tarnish? Gold does not seem to tarnish nearly as badly as silver. Silver tarnishes pretty quickly. This piece, which I finished like 2 months ago, has not really tarnished at all at this point. And in fact, a lot of the extant embroideries, you see tarnish, but it's not horrible. Like they don't glow quite as much as this does. But you can still definitely tell that it's gold. But getting into the background pattern, how do you actually get this on here in this pattern? So you'll notice, actually, I'll put the slide back up. Wrong window. Just a second. All right, I'm presenting a window. Here we go. Yes. Okay, so if we go back to this slide here, so you can see these nice zigzags that are quite precise. So how I did this, there are two ways that you can achieve the pattern. You can draw it onto the background, or you can count it just like you would count, pattern darning or German brick stitch or something like that. So I chose to count this. And so this is the same pattern actually that you see on this piece. This is the extant piece that I was going from. So it's just one long followed by two shorts. along 2 shorts. And then I believe there are 8 in the chevron before you go back up the next side. So that was all I did here. And really, once you had laid down the very first row, it's a little bit like Bargello in that sense. The first row took a long time, but then you could count all the other rows off of that row. And so it was not as painful as I thought it was going to be once I had the right material. Because you can see how nicely this passes through the fabric. So you're not seeing that juncture where the thread is kind of struggling with the fabric. It just goes through nicely. And so that's how you're able to see the pattern come through in such high relief. So the way that I achieved that, because it can be a little bit tricky when you're working through 2 layers of fabric, as I was here, I have my finer linen on the front and a slightly coarser linen on the back. And so as I was going through 2, if you're just going through 1 layer, you can pretty much poke up from the back. So underside couching is done by, you have a linen thread on the back of your work and you have the gold thread on the front of your work. And the gold thread never enters the eye of the needle. The gold thread is on a spool on top of your work. And what you do is, let's see, I'll do a little example here for you. So if we have this gold thread lying on top, you pass your needle through. So show that to you all. So the needle is passing through. So the linen thread comes up. And then you're going to pass it back through the exact same hole that you just came through. So I'm going to pull that through. And if you got it through the exact same hole, then it will pop through to the back. And you can see on the back, we have these little tiny nubs of gold. So the bare minimum of gold is being wasted on the back, which is kind of the brilliant engineering of this technique, is that it is the most economical use of this gold. It is basically, so you only have the tiniest little specks on the back of the fabric. So when I was working through the 2 layers, it was a little bit tricky to count. So what I did was I had a pin on top as well as my needle on the bottom. And what I would do to help me count, so I would count the threads from the top of the fabric, pierce a hole, and then come back through the bottom and find that hole again with the needle. And you can use a pretty big needle for the underside couching. So that was how I did the underside couching. So I'll just talk quickly about knots, and then we'll go into any questions that you guys have. So you'll notice that my final point is that knots are period. And one of the great things about the images from the Met Museum site is that they provide these fantastic pictures that you can look at in great detail. They're very high res, but also not only do they show you the front, they show you the back, which is really great. When you're studying embroidery, if you can see the back of a work, that almost tells you more than the front in terms of how it was constructed. So for example, you can see from this light colored float here that my cursor is pointing to, that light colored float is going over darker threads, which is telling you that the darker threads were laid first. But anyhow, the reason I have the slide here is to show you that knots are very period. Here's a knot, here's a knot, here's a bunch of knots, there's a knot in linen. And then here's my piece. Here's a knot, here's a whole mess of linen. So don't be afraid of using knots in the back of your work. They absolutely did that. And they had pretty long floats. I measured, I think one float was 1 centimeter long, which, in terms of Victorian embroidery was shocking. But in terms of this, they had no problem with that. So feel free to use knots, and I see here the linen is woven through a little bit to finish it. So they were not shy about making the backs of their works not completely pristinely clean. Okay, so do folks have questions from here? That is the bulk of my presentation. You'll notice at the end of your handout, I have a little section of books. So this is a fantastic book, The K. Stanaland Embroiderers. This talks not only about Opus work, but just generally the embroidery from that period. Who made it, how they made it. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. And the other book that I list, again, I showed this at the beginning of the class. This is fantastic if you can get your hands on it or if you can borrow it from a friend. It has wonderful articles as well as many, many amazing photographs of the Victoria and Albert exhibit that happened a couple of years ago. And then at the very bottom of your handout, you'll see I just listed where I got all of my materials to make my recreation so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel again. Okay, so let's take a look at questions. Okay, did the gilt tambour tarnish? No, it did not. I have not observed tarnishing yet. Was there a specific thread count for the linen? This is an excellent question, or the fabric that is the backing. Okay, so this is something that I was trying to hunt down. So the linen used for the backing fabric is described as fine linen. So I found in from an archaeological site in London from around this period, they found linens of about 20 threads per centimeter, which is about like how many threads per inch? Like 45-ish threads per inch. So that I interpreted to be a medium weight because those were for shirts and things like that. And so I interpreted fine as more than 20 threads per centimeter. So the linen that I got is from Burnley and Trowbridge. And again, that it says that on your handout. It is their finest thread count linen. It was 60 threads per inch, which is about 24 threads per centimeter. After I had already started my embroidery, I discovered a piece in the British Museum. There's one Opus Anglicanum piece there. It's a pretty damaged fragment, but the wonderful thing about that piece, or that piece in that museum, is that the British Museum told you how many threads per inch there were of the linen, of the gold, and of the silk embroidery, which was amazing. And it turned out there were 20 threads per centimeter of that linen. So the material that I ended up using was finer than that piece. That doesn't mean that that fineness of linen was not used in period. But I know that that one piece at least had 20 threads per centimeter. However, the gold that I ended up using was 0.2 millimeters, which was the tiniest bit on the small side. So the fact that the fabric was also the tiniest bit on the fine side, the two worked well together. So it was a fortuitous combination of materials. For those of us not in the East, is there a website, a Facebook page? That's a good question. Okay, so Elena, is this an MOIS question here?
Yes, I will drop the link into the website. Also, I will drop two different links into the chat window. One is our MOAS East Kingdom collection of these webinars, and you can check it every so often and see what we have scheduled. Also, we announce everything to several of the East Kingdom sites. We're also trying to announce them to the SCA Virtual, but I'll drop a couple of those links in the...
Yes, thank you. So the final measurement of this piece, I think it's like 7 inches this way and like 3.5 inches that way. It's not huge, but not super tiny. Let's see. Was the embroidery they were making used for clothing, or oh, this is a really good question. Okay, so Opus Anglicanum was specifically used for church vestments. That is what we know. That is what we can observe and see in the extant embroideries. Was this used on, for example, a king's coronation robe? Maybe, we don't know. this kind of opulent embroidery with gold and things, I would imagine would have been used sparingly on clothing that would be used often. If you think about it, church vestments are used at most once a week, but they're also cycled through seasonally. So it's like 4 or 5 times a year, maybe. So there's not a ton of wear. These pieces are not wearing out a lot. So you would probably, less time would have been spent on clothing that would be worn a lot. You might still have really expensive materials. I mentioned earlier that we don't have a lot of extant royal pieces because those were scavenged for the jewels and the pearls and the gold. So they wore out or they were scavenged or both. So yeah, the techniques used for clothing, I mean, church robes, yes, they're technically clothing, but they're not like, a shirt or a dress or something like that. So clothing items, probably you would see applique and other techniques. The Kay Stanland book, this book talks more in more detail about other stitches that were used. So this is a fantastic resource. Okay, other questions? Yes, Mistress Amy brings up the Keepers of Athena's thimble, which is the Embroidery Guild of the East, which is a wonderful resource, and we have a great time. So we have a Facebook page, Keepers of Athena's thimble. I encourage you to check that out. For the underside couching, is the gold going through both the fine linen ground? Okay, this is a great question. So is the gold going through both layers of fabric is the question, or is it being tacked down between? It is going through both layers. So as I said, my piece is 2 layers, and you can see kind of these little nubbins of gold going through. And the same is true on the extant pieces. Some of the pictures in the V&A book specify if it's 1 layer or 2 layers of linen. And even on the ones with 2 layers of linen, yes, it goes all the way through to the back. So when you're counting, I thought that this was going to be a hot mess when I was trying to count it, having 2 different weaves. But actually, you just count it on the front, and what happens on the back, and it's actually it turns out just fine. Any source for the fabric? Yes. So I got my linen at Burnley and Trowbridge, which should be at the bottom of your handout. Okay. So with the shading, I didn't mean to do one color and then another. I meant, say you're doing 5. Let's see. The person who asked the shading question, could you elaborate on that a little bit for me? You can just unmute yourself and you were. Oh no. Okay. Okay. I didn't mean you do one color and then another. I meant, say you're doing 5 lines of each color. You do for light blue, 1 medium blue, then 1 more light blue. So could you rephrase it? Sorry, my brain is not working right now. Do 1 color. So, like I wasn't counting lines of stitching, if that's what you're getting at. I was trying to be a little bit more painterly about it. So, so when I was doing, for example, the very dark blue, the darkest of the shading, that I would try and do like 3 or 4. I think I started out doing just 2 in the beginning and then discovered that would get clobbered by the other colors and it would end up not being visible enough. So I think I ended up, you can see up here that the dark blue line is very, very thin here. That's because that's only 2 rows. Whereas down here, I think I was using 3, 4, and down here a whole bunch, like 5 or 6 rows. And then after I put in the dark, I wasn't necessarily counting rows. I was just trying to go by how I thought the shading would work out. So it took a little bit of trial and error. As you can see, parts of this, the shading is less fantastic than other parts. So there was quite a learning curve to this, which is why this was done by professional embroiderers, not hobbyists at home. So you were coloring in the lines. Ah, yes. Okay. No, you were not overlapping colors. It is one color and then another color laid next to each other. I did occasionally do some editing by going over other colors, but you run the risk of kind of creating a mess of threads if you're putting one color on top of another. So this is not silk shading in the sense that it is used in modern embroidery. In modern embroidery, silk shading is long and short stitch. This is not that. This is one line of split stitch with another line of split stitch right next to it, butted so close together that they kind of meld together, but they're not one on top of the other. Does that answer your question? Okay, do we have any other questions? I think we've gotten through all the ones in the chat. So feel free, from Mistress Amy, is there any evidence of color underneath the threads? Or are you seeing the same thing in extant pieces shading by eye? I have not, so are you asking, was there paint, was the background painted in pigment? No, it's pretty much just black and white. Chinini talks about using a wash of different shades of black ink that you could actually like do a full-on watercolor painting. And there's an Italian, let me see. There's an Italian piece at the Met. It's a later date, but it's really interesting. And you can see some of the background. Let's see. Can I find it? Yes. Okay. All right. I'll screen share this in just a second. Yeah, this is awesome. Okay. Whoops. That's not what I meant. Present now a window. Okay. So here's a great example of the underpainting. So we have some darker lines and then a little bit that's kind of colored in there. But there's no pigment and it's not solidly filled. Does that answer your question? You just
No, I was going to say, hi, yeah, that was just my question. I mean, it's really an impressive artistry. You know what I mean? Both of your pieces, the stamp pieces, to do that shading with the thread. So I was just curious as to whether or not there was any evidence that it was more of a paint by number thing happening. Yeah. But no, but that Italian piece is a great example that, yeah, maybe sometimes there was sort of a guide.
Yeah. So that was the real challenge of this piece. I didn't realize what a challenge I had given myself, not copying an extant embroidery, but going from an extant illumination. Because if I had been going from an extant embroidery, I would have been able to see what colors they used where and when they had changed. Whereas I had to figure all that out, and it was hard. It was very stressful. But once I realized that all you have to do is look at the extant pieces and see exactly, okay, how did this stitcher treat this particular way the fabric folded? For example, to get the fabric going across the knees, I found as many different pieces of people sitting with their knees in this configuration as I could, and noticed where they put the darks, where they put the lights, and what direction the shading was done. So yes, that is where the skill really comes into this this embroidery art form, because it's not the skill in executing beautiful, complicated stitches. It's the skill in figuring out the artistry. And yeah, I see the Jacobian class. Was that the RSN class? I also just did that class. Yes, it is a different type of shading from Jacobian crewel work. All right. Any other questions? And you can feel free to unmic yourself and just ask live in the mic at this point. All right. No other questions. Do we have any people working on similar pieces, or have you ever tried this kind of embroidery before?
I tried a 2-inch by 2-inch sampler of it once, and it was hard. That's all I got.
Did you do the underside couching, as well as the silk, or was it just the couching?
I did the just the underside couching because Split Stitch and I are not friends. We just don't like each other. It's mutual.
I also hate split stitch, which is it was very masochistic of me to take this on.
I don't know where you get that from.
I have no idea. Elena is my Laurel, for those of you who don't know. Yeah, the shading has always scared me. Yes, it still kind of scares me, but it was really cool to take it on and just try and see what happened. And it was not all perfect, but it was an adventure and it was very fun. Yep, just started working with filament silk. Yeah, it's an experience with filament silk. It's you need a lot of lotion. I undertook this project, of course, at the beginning of fall and winter, which is not a great time to start working with filament silk because your hands get very chapped and you need a lot of lotion.
So I have like all the materials for it, and I've got all the books. Like I have every single book that you've mentioned, except for the Della Arte book. I'm actually gonna go ahead and put that on order here today. It'll be a few days, of course, with Amazon being what it is. But what I personally love split stitch. 99% of my projects are all split stitch.
Nice.
It's just the easier thing to do. When I actually get the time, I do plan on doing a piece. I bought the challenge that I had is that I like doing practical embroidery, like to go on a garment or to go on or something like that. So my hang up with the Opus is that other than the ecclesiastical stuff, there's really no secular application that I've been able to figure out to do it for, other than like slapping it on the back of a cloak or something like that. So I don't know. I'm thinking I might want to do it like would a pouch be good? But I haven't seen anything indicating that it was used like as a pouch or anything. I don't know. I just haven't. Have you run into that? I mean,
yeah, that's a really good question. So you don't see, Opus Anglicanum was specifically for the ecclesiastical embroidery, but you do see those French alms pouches, the aumônière pouches. That's the closest thing that's not a robe, that's like a small practical thing to wear that you're probably going to find. Again, it's not really Opus Anglicanum because it's not using underside couching, it's using surface couching, but often it is done with the split stitch, and you could do it with underside couching if you wanted. I mean, there's no saying the embroidery police are not going to come after you if you do that.
Oh yeah, no, I'm of the opinion that embroidery is made to be used, and it's not. Obviously you've got your pretty piece, and obviously I've seen your piece, and like I would like to see it one day in person and like try not to drool on it. But for me, it's just I am of the opinion that embroidery is to be used and to be. I actually believe that that's why we don't have a lot of secular pieces. Or
yeah, absolutely.
Because they wore that stuff. They wore them out to death, and that's
absolutely.
I'm a-okie doke with that. So. But yeah, no, I'm going to go there one day.
Awesome.
I'm ready to go there. I just have to get through all of my commissions first. But anyway, thank you so much for this class. It's
you are so welcome.
Given me a lot of this stuff, like I kind of already knew, but it gives me confirmation of what I knew. And then the materials themselves, like the yeah. So you rock. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. So someone just asked about the seat cushion, and I'm so glad you did, because this is a little detail that I'm excessively proud of. So I'm going to turn back on the screen sharing, because the seat cushion is a perfect example of where they clearly had a convention of how they did it. So yes, if you look at this seat cushion, you'll see what I've actually done is it's laid work. So what it is long threads of the filament silk with the gold laid over it, and then couched with more silk thread. And I did that copying some of, let me see, no, that was the opposite of what I wanted. I was looking at other seat cushions that were embroidered. It's kind of this self-referential little nod to the embroideries that people were kind of embroidering embroideries. If you think about it, the seat cushions, that's something that would have been embroidered in period. So something I looked at was this chasuble at the Met. There are some fabulous seat cushions here. Let me get this nice and big for you guys. Like this bit right here, and this is a little bit different. This is actually more like canvas work what they've done, but there are other examples. I just don't have good pictures of them on my computer, where it is just laid across like what I've done. But you can see here that the gold is laid across and then stitched over. So this is actually like canvas work that's meant to look like laid work. So yes, thank you for asking that question so I could show off my little details. That was very fun. Okay. Are there any other open?
Amalia, you got muted.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry, where did I cut out? Or when did I cut out?
You had just like 5 seconds ago.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, someone had just asked, do you see opus? I think it's, do you see the word opus paired with words other than Anglicanum? The answer is yes. But Opus Anglicanum is the phrase you see the most often, but there is Opus Teutonicum or something like that, German work. Other nationalities will have that word. I have actually a French embroidery book. I have to learn French so I can read it. But it talks about different opuses.
The Cluny design book. The design. I bought that too, and yeah, I need to learn French. Anybody?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
yes, you gotta go to Chamara.
Part of me wants to email the museum and say, "Hey, can you guys make a translation available? I'll buy it."
Yeah, that would be really cool.
So no, I bought that book. Do you subscribe to Mary Corbett's Needle and Thread?
Oh, absolutely.
That's where I got. Okay, go.
Then, yeah, that's also where I found out about it. Yes.
I feel like we've bonded. I need to
Absolutely. Yes. Okay, Marietta, you said sweet bags question mark. Was that a question or a suggestion for a possible project?
I think she said that there was a suggestion, and
okay.
The thing is that sweet bags are such an Elizabethan thing, and there's all like Jackie Carey is like the
yes,
so
exactly.
So the idea crossed my head, but that's already got its own little subcategory in the embroidery world. I was thinking of trying to find like something that was uniquely of that period, which those almoner bags are probably the closest we're going to get.
I will say I'm also thinking of the bourse, which is I think where the communion elements were held. I'm just thinking that's a smaller item. It's not really a purse, but you could use it that way. Okay, here we go. I'll screen share this with you. The bourse, I think it's what they put the elements of communion in. And it looks like a purse. So this is a bourse right here.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that.
And there's also like a circular one in the book that I have. So that's a possible option.
Yeah, because the other thing is I guess there's like a little, like a small, for lack of a better term, tablecloth that covers up the bowl for something like, I forget.
Oh yeah, the elements of communion. Yeah, I forget what those are called.
Yeah.
They do have a technical term.
They do have, that was another option that I was thinking for like a competition piece or something like that.
Yeah.
And then when you get a checksum, we do. I think we had another question.
Okay. Yes. Go for it.
I think it got stuck in up above, or I may. Are there any other opus techniques other than Anglicanum?
Okay. So I
did we catch that on 9 minutes or?
I was talking about that there's Opus Teutonicum, or however you pronounce that.
Yeah,
did that answer that question for whoever asked it? If you could just clarify if that's what you were getting at, Leonora. Let's see. Oh, yeah, you did. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. Great. Okay. Are there any? Yes. Any other questions?
Can anybody spell it for me, the second one?
Let's see. The internet might help me.
Listening to something. What's up?
Okay. Opus Teutonicum. I'm going to put it in the chat for you. There you go. Does that help?
I just muted the person because she was chatting in the background. So I just muted her. It's a good example.
So I posted on the SCA virtual site yesterday or today about, so I'm just starting to work with filament silk. I was gifted some and I wanted to use it. So I'm embroidering some pelicans on a reliquary bag, and I'm having a hard time getting my fill to be solid with the filament silk.
Yeah, I saw that post. Yes. Yeah. Are you able to show video of it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, turn on your video. There you go. Okay. So if you hold it like really close and really still, let's see. Okay, it's not really coming through, but that's okay. I saw your picture. If you could, so I was the person that responded that like you can either double it up or you can actually split the filament silk like in half. It's super annoying, but as I explained earlier, filament silk is made up of several tiny strands that are like spider webs. So if you're really feeling adventurous, you could try doing like 1.5 strands.
The stuff that I have, it looks like they took 2 strands of filament and twisted them together, but they're not. It's not like a solid twist. It still shreds when you touch it.
Okay, is this like antique silk?
I don't know. It was a gift from a friend. They found a bunch of colors and somebody had dyed it in a range of colors. It's already really cool, but it's hard to work with. It keeps shredding when I touch it.
Oh,
touches on everything.
Like it snags. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Like it snags on rough skin?
It snags on my fabric too.
Okay. So first of all, the easiest step is just to use shorter lengths of thread to begin with. Like don't cut like 2 feet of thread. Do that, their fingers to elbow trick. Because the longer the thread, the more opportunity it has to catch on stuff. Also, someone had mentioned a laying tool, and that's what this is. This right here is a laying tool.
I need to get one of those.
So, and in fact, you can just use like a tapestry needle if you don't have one.
All right.
What you do with it is you don't really want to wax the silk filament most of the time because that's the filament likes to kind of fluff up and spread out and fill things nicely. And if you wax it, I think it would just stay still. But yeah, so how you use the laying tool is, so you'll take a stitch. Let me see if I can get my sampler. Yeah. So you'll take a stitch, and I'm using linen right now, but this is just to show you how you use it. So as you're running through, you pick it up with your laying tool, and then pull it through with the laying tool on top until it's laid safely, and so it's less likely to snag.
Okay, and I do that with my finger, so it's snagging on my skin.
Right. So if you just use a tapestry needle instead of your finger, you might have more success with that. But yeah,
Okay.
it does take some getting used to.
Okay. I'm trying to teach myself. My grand Laurel passed away last year, and she was the one in Eldemere, it's where I'm from, who did all of the work with our like silk work and stuff. And so unfortunately I didn't get to learn from her before she passed away. So I'm trying to figure this out on my own a lot of the time.
Okay. And yeah, Mistress, so you said you're in Eldemere? Yeah. So, do you guys have an embroidery guild where you are? Do you know in your kingdom?
Not a medieval embroidery guild, no.
Okay, because the East does, and we're happy to be friends with other people who are not Easterners. So feel free to visit the Athena's Thimble Facebook page.
Okay.
People will be happy to answer questions.
I will probably send some more people your way. I got to like actually see your. I went to Burka this year, so I got to see and like touch your piece, and it was amazing.
Oh yay! Awesome.
Our princess went as well, and we were both. She's done a little bit of Opus work, so we were both drooling over it. It was gorgeous.
Thank you. That's awesome. Yes, Marietta, I'm glad I was able to explain laying tools for you. It's not obvious. Okay.
I'm gonna save that.
Oh yes, and Elena just put the Athena's Thimble link in our chat.
Thank you so much. I will go on that after this. Thank you for answering all my questions. I figured it'd be easier to wait and talk to you after the video than it would be to try to word on Facebook because I don't word well.
Awesome. I'm glad I could help.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else? All right, I think that about wraps it up then, unless I'll give you guys like 10 more seconds to ask questions.
What's your next project going to be?
My next project. So the whole reason I did this project in the first place was so that I could eventually get to Elizabethan polychrome embroidery, because that terrifies me. So my next project is probably Elizabethan polychrome, but I might try and do Ornue, because that's like the in-between link historically. The techniques aren't necessarily related, but it's interesting to kind of go through the history. I'm going through the history of European gold work, basically. So that's my like 5-year plan of embroidery.
So on behalf of the MOAS office, we want to say thank you so much. This was a wonderful class. Thank you everyone who came as well. And we've got the links to more webinars and such that will be coming up that I dropped in the chat window before. So keep an eye on that for more classes. But seriously, this was amazing and so informative. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming and have a great night.
Thank you for the class. I learned a lot.
Awesome. And feel free to email me if you have any questions. I think my email's on the handout.